There's a woman that silently prays outside of an abortion clinic. She's been arrested several times and thrown in jail for thought crimes. And it's all under the guise of these online safety bills and these censorship bills and these free speech bills.
Who defines hate speech? Because I see a massive issue with people conflating hate speech with speech that they hate.
And they don't realize that they are being used to push these bills into place so that we can all be under the thumb of the government at one time or another.
The government is also projecting a $40 billion deficit for this fiscal year and higher deficits in the years to come.
Trudeau, like you said, he printed between $400 and $600 billion since COVID. He also doubled our national debt, doubled the cost of rent, doubled the cost of buying a home, pretty much doubled the price of gas, not quite. Groceries went up over 300%. You look at all these things, there's no fiscal responsibility, there's no care for the citizens. Hi, everybody. Welcome to the Blendr Report, where news meets rational thinking. I'm your host, Jonathan Harvey, and this is your fill-in co-host, Liam DeBoer. Liam, what's up, bro?
Pleasure to be here. Excited to get chatting.
Yeah, just talk some shit. Before we get into it, I will just ask everybody to like and comment and follow us on social media. And if you really like what we're doing, please go to blendrnews.com and sign up for our daily newsletter. All right, let's get into it.
So first things first, the new hate speech and censorship bill. So despite the initial bill tabled in June 2021 not being passed, a federal justice minister reaffirmed the commitment to introducing a new version. The complexity of the legislation, which involves balancing free speech and restricting online harms, was acknowledged by experts. To be effective, the bill may need to establish a regulator to hold social media companies accountable for hateful content on their platforms, with the power to impose significant fines. So I'm sure you and I think very similarly about this, but the biggest problem I see with this topic is who defines hate speech? Because I see a massive issue with people conflating hate speech with speech that they hate.
Yeah, that's a really good point, actually. That's really well put. I mean, for me, it's the whole apparatus. It's the whole censorship apparatus. And for me, this is kind of the cherry on top. And I think that's, we talk about on this podcast, and you and I have gone over this, before too, is, Bill C-11, your Online News Act, your Online Streaming Act, and now this Online Harms Bill. And when you put all these three things together, you have a very, very serious censorship weapon that is going to stifle, like you said, conversation around the country that is not necessarily hate speech, but speech that people hate. So, for me, my red flag here, well, there's a few of them, but number one really is, like you said, who gets to define what is hate speech? Because whoever this person is or whoever this group is, they're going to be towing some political line. That's all this is, right? And it's going to switch from side to side. But what's even more dangerous about this is they are now going to proactively be able to go to all these social media companies and basically tell them, this is your stance on this issue. Russia, Ukraine, we're for Ukraine. Israel, Hamas, or Palestine, we are for Israel. COVID, we are for vaccines. And if anybody says anything against any of this stuff, it's now harmful. It's hate speech. It's all these other things. And, I don't see a way out of this. Now, people, I'm a big proponent of voting conservative these days. Not that I'm always conservative or Republican. I really don't believe in being all one side. If you are, I think you're not really a free thinker. I think you have to sort of understand the political climate at the time. But in this particular case, you want to vote conservative to sort of right the ship. But there's been no conversation about repealing this particular bill. There's been no, and here's why. You look at stuff like this and you go, who does it benefit? Well, it benefits the people in power, right? And while Poilievre, I do respect what he's trying to do for the country, and I do stand behind him specifically, who knows who's next in line? They may not feel the same way. We may not feel the same way about those people. So what politicians always do, might put it on the shelf, not completely repeal it. And when they need to use it, they will pull it back off. So people like us, we're kind of always sitting ducks. But the biggest problem with this is that people on the left that want to define this stuff as hate speech because it's speech that they hate, they just don't realize. They're only looking in front of their face, because very short, down the road, not too far, mile, 2 miles, year, 2 years, they're going to be the shoe's going to be on the other foot. They're going to be the people that are going to be getting silenced for their views. And so when things like this get implemented, I kind of look and I go, the Democrats or the liberals right now are just they're being weaponized. They're told these things. And like you said, they're given sort of a false narrative on what this really means. And they don't realize that they are being used to push these bills into place so that we can all be under the thumb of the government at one time or another. So for me, I mean, the whole thing's a nightmare.
The Soviets had a good term for those types of people, useful idiots. They were the types.
Very well put.
They were the types that pushed the revolution along, helped instill the dictatorship against their own good wishes. That's for sure.
There are live examples of this that people refuse to look at. It's similar to when Trudeau pulled in Bill C-18. They're like, well, we're going to start charging these news companies hundreds of millions of dollars a year, and we're going to make them pay our mainstream media companies. And people go, that's fucking wild. They're not going to do that. And obviously they did. Now, I had a blind spot here. I didn't see this. I didn't realize that they already did this in Australia. And you know exactly what happened. Big tech blocked the news. So Trudeau knew this was going to happen. In other words, the government is a step or two ahead when they're the one making the plans, right? So the same thing with this online harms bill. People are going, well, no, this is just going to stop hate speech and Nazis and all the terrible people in the world. Sure. Except if you look at how this is playing out in the UK under the OSB, the Online Safety Bill, they throw people in jail for thought crimes now. There is a woman, and this is a very specific example, and maybe it's a little over the top, but it is what it is. It's literally a thought crime. There's a woman that silently prays outside of an abortion clinic. Silently. She's been arrested several times and thrown in jail for thought crimes. And it's all under the guise of these online safety bills and these censorship bills and these free speech bills. So the thing is, not only will you get deplatformed, maybe demonetized, all those other things, you're going to go to jail for having thoughts that the government doesn't agree with. This is so Orwellian, and I don't think people realize that once they push this over the cliff, it just falls down and blows up. There's no saving this once this comes into play.
I think the biggest worry with this kind of stuff as well is it seems like they have these movements and these power grabs have a sense of inertia to them where they don't stop unless it meets a force that can essentially stop it in its tracks with equal resistance. Left to their own, it's just going to steamroll until everything is just going to start getting encapsulated under this term of hate speech. And there's actually a great, when you referenced Orwell, there's a great quote. He said, whether he wrote down with Big Brother or whether he refrained from writing it made no difference. Whether he went on with the diary or whether he did not go on with it made no difference. The thought police would get him all the same. He had committed, would still have committed, even if he had never set pen to paper, the essential crime that contained all others within itself. Thought crime, they called it. Thought crime was not a thing that could be concealed forever. You might dodge successfully for a while, even for years, but sooner or later, they were bound to get you. And that's one of those ideas where I think people turn off their alarm system to it in this moment. Well, it's only people that say speak ill about transgenderism, and I'm for transgenderism, so this isn't going to negatively affect me. But then it's just the next thing and the next thing that all gets brought into that, and eventually, as Orwell pointed out in 1984, eventually the thought crimes will be limitless and everybody will be guilty of them one way or another.
Yeah, I mean, that's a really good point. I couldn't agree more. I think you wrapped that up nicely, and I hope that people pay attention to it.
Cool. All right, let's move on here. So the chair of a taxpayer-funded panel reviewing Alberta's COVID-19 response, Preston Manning, is urging the federal Conservatives to use the panel's findings against Prime Minister Justin Trudeau's coalition in the next election. Manning's email suggests that the report could be weaponized to criticize the Liberal NDP coalition's handling of the 2020 to 2023 COVID crisis. Something that I wonder here is, first, how nobody has been held accountable for these issues yet. And secondly, I think also there has to be some sort of responsibility put on the Conservatives during that time as well, because they didn't do, under Aaron O'Toole, they did a pretty terrible job of doing anything that could be considered opposition.
Yeah, Aaron O'Toole's a wiener. Sorry, he is. That's exactly what the guy is. Summed up in a word, the dude's a wiener. I mean, there's a couple things here, right? First of all, I totally agree with you on the accountability thing. No one has clean hands on this. I think it was very incendiary where people were afraid in the political sphere to make an error. And I think that's one of the things that sort of defines politics more than it should, is everyone's afraid to make a mistake, right? So when you're young, you make mistakes, and that's how you progress. And when you're an entrepreneur and you do things like you and I do, we make mistakes, and that's okay. Like, I'm a big fan of fail fast. Really, fuck things up. I'm a supporter. Let's go. But in the political sphere, it's anything but. And it's so preposterous that you'll daisy chain the fault of someone to find a fall guy, rather, that's like 5 steps away from something just so you're not responsible. It's Trudeau's famous thing right now. It's probably always been the case. He never takes responsibility for anything. That's just kind of what it is. And I think you saw that permeate through politics, through COVID. which was interesting because it really forced different parts of society, like the societal apparatus, to push back. So it had to be doctors, it had to be scientists, it had to be individuals like me. Like, I'm an idiot. I shouldn't be the one talking about COVID, but I learned so much, and I did, I think a reasonable job in putting my thoughts and ideas together for people because there was no other way to do it, which was interesting, in the sense that it did sort of mobilize this independent force within society that I think is a very big positive for us. So even though you're right, no one's hands were clean, I think the silver lining is that there's a group of us now in society that realize how powerful we are and, that we can use these tools to sort of push back. So there's a little bit of value there, but like you said, there's been no accountability here. And while the conservatives do have to take some of that, the large majority has to fall on the people that were really in charge, which is really Trudeau. It really is the Liberal government, but it's interesting because I really don't think he makes a lot of decisions for himself. I think he's told how to manage most situations. And I also think that he toes the line of a lot of other supporting countries. I think the United States primarily. So, there's that part of it. But what was interesting in this article is, the NDP, Notley, she said unwavering support. She had unwavering support for how they managed COVID. And I thought to myself, do you know what you even did? Like, you start with lockdowns, you do the masks, you realize none of these things really worked. You look at the mandates, you look at them pulling people over in their cars to see if they're with someone from another household. You look at them carding people, kicking people and giving them tickets, kicking them out of parks and giving them in the outside, giving them tickets for stuff like that. Fast tracking a vaccine and signing for hundreds of millions of doses without even understanding the efficacy, let alone the safety. Mandating these things and telling these people you have to take them. Firing federal workers because they refuse to take them. Stopping people from going to businesses if they didn't toe this line. I mean, everything they did throughout this entire process was a fucking disaster. And it's crazy to me that they even had to hire, and this was a government-funded panel, that they had to pay $2 million to hire a guy to tell us how fucking bad this was, and they're still in denial of it. I mean, it's wild to me. It should be incredibly obvious, but I would say the positive side in all of this is that there is now a live document within the government that has said, hey, look, we did do a really bad job of this, regardless of whether they pay attention to it or not. It's good that these things exist. We did a bad job. Here's where we went wrong, and here's how we can do things next time so we don't really stifle individual freedoms. We still give people, sort of the freedom to choose. We don't shut down and ruin the economy. Here are some things we can look at. Here's some filters that we can use, and maybe some thresholds that we need to hit before we just pull the rug out from under everybody. You know what I mean? So that's at least sort of the positives. But in terms of, how this is being viewed, I mean, when the opposition is basically pointing at Alberta and trying to ostracize them for doing this and asking them if they support horse dewormer still, I mean, it just shows you that we do not have politicians that are interested in doing what's right for Canadians. We have politicians that are worried about power and profit over the people and progress for society.
Yeah, one of the biggest issues I see with being able to actually confront and hold these people responsible is the apathy that's going around in the general population right now. There's a lot of people that just want to pretend like the COVID issues are behind us. It's, I don't want to talk about that. Why are people still talking about that? Can't we just move on? That was behind us. But then you look at a lot of the issues that we're now facing, whether they be economic or say from supply chains, globalism falling, all of this kind of stuff. How can you expect to solve those problems if you don't understand that the root of them in the cause a lot of it was to do with these policies? So for instance, the inflation that we're now seeing go through the roof is largely because of, one, they shut down the entire economy and then printed money to stimulate it while it was shut down. And you're like, if we are unable to recognize that is the first domino that fell to essentially where we're at now, where people are struggling to even keep a roof above their heads, then I don't see any way that we can actually move to start solving those solutions, because most people will just turn right back around to the government and go, well, the solution to these current economic crises is more government spending. But it's like, you need to fucking recognize that it was the government spending in the first place that caused it to get here. So yeah, I don't know. I see a lot of issues with just people trying to turn a blind eye to what happened over the last 3 years.
Yeah, you know what? I think this in particular is an interesting one because people made a choice. They had an opinion about things. And I think a lot of people are having trouble accepting the fact that they had the wool pulled over their eyes. I think it's embarrassing for people. I think people subconsciously just fight it whether they know it or not, because I think it breaks a little bit of who they've become. And here's a big reason why I think COVID was an interesting one. You know, you've got the issue, obviously, of the government apparatus and propaganda that was behind a lot of this that convinced people of all these things which were wild. They made no sense. But this was them weaponizing media at scale and doing a really, really great job. Probably the best job in history. I mean, they made Big Pharma the hero, for Christ's sake. People got Pfizer tattoos. I think I said that on the last podcast, but it's still so crazy. But here's another reason why I think people didn't really want to push back against this. If the doctors are saying it, the government is saying it, your family is saying it, your parents are saying it, the media is saying it, blah, 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 blah. Everybody you know, and you're ostracized if you don't do it. If you question it, you pull this thread. And this thread is to the entire sweater of your fabric of reality. You have to question everything. If you go, the doctors were wrong, well, I've always trusted doctors. They gave me vaccines when I was a kid. This is where I go when I'm sick. And if you don't trust the doctors, then you're like, well, who brought me to the doctor? My parents brought me to the doctors. So you start having to unravel all of your beliefs in things that are foundational for who you are today. And so it seems like a small decision, an easy one to make. I think you pull the thread. But the problem is it's the tip of the iceberg. What lies beneath that is such a substantial shakeup for most people that I don't really think they're willing to face it. And that's why I think you're seeing apathy and people just trying to forget about it and move on. Will they let it happen again? Maybe not. Maybe the next time something like this happens, they're going to go, deep down inside, I know I was fucked. I know that these people lied, but I'm not willing to accept it. And on this one issue, maybe that's what happens. And hopefully they take that lesson. And then whatever happens next, because we know there's going to be something, they use a different lens to view the government, the world, their parents, the doctors, whoever are involved, the scientists, whoever are involved that are sort of feeding us these lies. But I really don't think, regardless of what information comes out, I really don't think we're going to see a big scale pushback against how things were managed, because people will have to accept responsibility and shatter their current reality.
I think two things to build off of there. There's one, which is a great quote, which is it's easier to fool a person than to convince them they've been fooled. And second, there's the added weight of the fact where a lot of the people that had, say, this pulled over their eyes and they were blindly going along with authority, they don't feel like they were just lied to and they have to admit to themselves that they were lied to. They have to justify a lot of the positions they took, which was, for instance, if you didn't get this experimental medication, that you now shouldn't be able to leave your home, or you shouldn't have the same freedoms, or you should lose your jobs. Some people would have even gone as far to say that the unvaccinated should have been jailed. Lots of people did. So it's not just, I have to admit to myself that I was fooled. It's also, I would then have to apologize to everybody that I took an inhumane stance against based on those lies.
Yeah, like you have to admit that you were the villain. Good fucking luck with that. That's not going to happen. So yeah, no, I totally agree. Hopefully something comes of it. Hopefully, the conservatives do, because I think this was actually one of their big positions in sort of getting into power, is maybe riding the ship on a lot of this stuff. So hopefully they do implement something to give people like you and I a little bit of confidence that it's not going to happen again. However, it's politics and it's power and it's money, and we don't really know where it's going to land, but one can hope.
All right, on to climate change. There was a recent report by Oxfam, which has highlighted the disproportionate environmental impact of Mexico's wealthiest individuals, which they then extrapolated and put onto the global scenario. So the report, published in conjunction with the 2023 United Nations Climate Change Conference in Dubai, reveals that in 2019, the richest 1% in Mexico were responsible for more than 80% of the country's pollution. Oxfam proposes a radical solution, a 60% tax on the incomes of the richest 1%. So what's your thoughts there?
Well, it's not a solution. It's just not. Sorry. So first of all, when you take a study in a country like Mexico and you extrapolate that and then say that it's the entire world, that's flawed logic to begin with. It's sort of like you're manipulating data to suit your needs, right? The next thing is when you say you're going to tax the rich 60%. So there's a couple things you got to consider there. First of all, that's never going to happen. Literally, there's no possibility of it happening because, first of all, they run the governments. Rich people run the government. We know this. They fund both sides. That's pretty straightforward. Second of all, there's no government apparatus in place that's going to allow them to take that kind of money from all these rich people. There's no way. Like, they're the ones that sort of shaped policy, right? And if for some reason things start moving in that direction, what you're going to see is everyone's going to move their money further offshore. That's exactly what they're going to do. So it's a dead end. It's not really a solution. So here's what I actually think it is. I'll get into the climate stuff after, because right now I just think this is an attack on rich people. Instead of working through a solution, the government now, by taxing these people or suggesting to tax these people at 60%, you're just saying that it's the rich person's fault. That's all you're doing. You're just placing blame on someone else, and you're vilifying them. You're finding a villain, and you're saying, well, if they give us all of their money rather, we can solve this problem, which is unequivocally false. Giving the government money to fix a problem never works. Like you mentioned the other day, look at homelessness. I think, like, I may get this number wrong, but I think it's $300 million a year. It could be billion, but I think it's $300 million a year that goes into solving homelessness in California. And it's only getting worse, which means all they're doing is taking taxpayer dollars and putting it into the pockets of people that are doing an inefficient job. Said this the other day too, with like the CMHC. They've had $15 billion in government funding over the last 7-8 years. They had one project in particular where they were supposed to build 687 homes. They built 12. Their efficiency was 2%. So giving these people money doesn't solve the problem. What you have is people that just want to take more money and more power away from people that have money and power. That's the way I'm seeing this study. I think it's fucking bullshit. Now, one of the other things that I would like to highlight is when they say the richest 1% of people are responsible for 80% of the pollution, when you say that, you got to ask yourselves, where's the majority of pollution coming from? The majority is coming from the commercial sector, energy, production, all this other stuff. Now, these rich people own these things. So obviously you can lump that under these people to be like, well, they own this stuff, therefore they're responsible for the pollution. However, that's kind of a false, it gives people this sort of like this false sense of you can blame someone else for this because you and I are the ones that use them. Everybody uses them. You use them to heat your own homes. You use them to drive around, whether it's the car or the gasoline you're putting in your car. You know what I mean? Anywhere where you're seeing massive pollution, they are producing something that the rest of society uses so that they can survive. So we're all kind of playing the same game. These people are just the ones making money off of it. Because if you try to take all the things away that are producing the largest amount of pollution, like fossil fuels, what happens to society? You cut fossil fuels today, we all die. Sorry, it's how it's going to go. So for me, that's definitely a big part of the problem. With respect to an actual solution here, if they would put some sort of incentivize these wealthy people to invest in, for-profit carbon reduction programs, then what you might do is you might get people that are sort of, want to be the good guys. And I can appreciate that. I think a lot of them do. I think if you ask people, do you want to save the earth? 99.9% of people are going to go, yeah, I do. I want the earth to be around for my kids and future generations. Well, here's how you can do it. If you invest in these programs that do make money, that do neutralize or reduce carbon, and you produce this much, here's how you can get to a net zero individually. Well, now there's a real solution. Instead of doing something like that, they just implement these programs that are just meant to vilify one side versus the other over power and money, and it's kind of bullshit.
Talking about these bureaucracies' inefficiencies at solving these issues, especially one as massive as this, which we don't, like, you can boil it down to they want to control the weather, which is just the idea that first off, the government is even competent enough to do that is just wildly ridiculous. But then you have to think about the fact that these bureaucracies, whether it be homelessness, whether it be climate change, all of this stuff, the people in them, they do not bear the consequences of the problem itself, and they also don't bear the consequences if they fail to solve the problem. Meaning, let's take homelessness, for example. The homeless people aren't sleeping on these bureaucrats' front doors, so they don't actually have to deal with the problem. And then second, if they spend all of this money and take from taxpayers and such, and then fail to solve the problem, they yet again do not face the consequences for that problem. So I think it's a Sowell quote, but he said, I can't think of a worse idea than putting people in charge of something that they don't bear the consequences of. It's just expecting a solution to come out of that is preposterous. But then you also look at how they want to solve this issue, which is, yes, take in this wealth and then subsidize certain areas, say EVs or green energy, all of this stuff. But then you look at what happens in practice was even earlier this year, was the American government announced a $7,000 subsidy, essentially tax credit, whatever, for buying an EV vehicle.
Right.
The very next day, all the manufacturers upped the prices of their EVs by $7,000. And you look at any single sector that the government heavily subsidizes, and they are all the most expensive, that have inflated the most over the last 50 years, are the exact industries which the government is heavily involved in. So the idea that, climate change will be solved by giving the government more money is mind-numbing to me.
Well, what would happen, actually, now that you mention it, is the rich people would just find ways to get all their money back. Like, hey, man, they outsmarted you the first time. They're going to do it again. Because the thing is, I think a lot of times, in most cases, I think if politicians could trade places with the richest people in the world and have success as entrepreneurs, that's what they would do. So, yeah, I couldn't agree more. I think that it's a dead-end solution to a problem that I'm not even sure is as bad as we think that it really is.
It's not. You look at, for instance, the apocalyptic narrative of climate change. Climate-related deaths or severe weather event deaths have dropped by 96% over the last 100 years. You look at things like, for instance,
that's so alarming.
you look at headlines over heat waves that happen in places. So, for instance, there was one this summer about the deadliest heat wave in India's history, which claimed 25,000 people. How they come up with that number, who knows? But then you can put that against the fact that same year, over 500,000 people in India died from extreme cold. So every year, no matter the country you take it, it's about 10 times more people die from extreme cold than extreme heat. And this idea I see being put out there where climate change, okay, I think the climate is changing, because I also don't think you can ever get it to stop changing.
Definitely not.
So really, we're now talking about a realistic, not stopping it, but what is a realistic rate that it can change at. And I don't think we're seeing anything, even their most alarming examples. I don't think you can say that, like, where are the consequences from these? Because as pointing out, like, the deaths from all of this stuff is just dramatically decreasing. And then also, we're getting better and better at adaptation. Like, even you look at things like, for instance, Holland, like Amsterdam should not exist. They carved that out of the ocean. Like this idea that if the water levels rise by an inch, humanity is doomed. You're like, no, we've actually proven over the last couple centuries that we're incredibly capable of dealing with these issues as they arise. But I think handicapping ourselves and essentially weakening our ability to face those problems by terrible economic policies and such, that when those issues come around, we'll only be worse off to deal with them now.
Yeah, I mean, I totally agree with you. I think that one of the big problems you have is that politicians don't think 20, 30 years down the road, right? They think 4 years in front of them, and they think re-election. That's how they operate. So they look at everything as this urgent issue that needs to be solved today, it's just not really true. And one of the things humans do not do well is we don't solve long-term problems very well. If you look at the rise in temperature from the 1800s to now, it's marginal, especially considering you're like, oh, here's our death point. It's like, it's actually not accurate. And if you look through history, there is a cyclical nature to there's ebbs and flows to how the earth is going to heat and cool. It's how it operates. And, you know, people that I've listened to that are on the other side of this, kind of where you and I sort of sit, they just say this whole thing. They're like, there's no solid science to really prove that this is going where they say that it's going. It's just, there's just nothing there. And, you know, you see these things like, you know, Al Gore's Inconvenient Truth and how the water levels are going to rise 20 feet. And I'm like, you guys know most of the earth is water, right? Already. So tell me how that displacement math is going to work, especially considering a lot of the glaciers up in north and southern points of the world are already in water. You ever put ice in water? It's all, when the ice is there, the water level is high. When it completely melts, it only goes, if at all. The displacement math doesn't quite work for me. Maybe someone smarter than I am could point out where I'm going wrong there, but I just don't see these figures adding up at all. And it just feels like more fear porn than anything.
Well, and all of the forecasts for the terrible things that are going to happen, whether you talk about Al Gore or the UN throughout the last 50 years, you know, humanity-wise, we have a short-term memory with the propaganda we've been fed.
Of course.
But if you go back and look from the 1940s to the 1970s, the global temperature was actually decreasing, which to me, I'm like, okay, that was the fallout of World War II was the largest industrial boom ever.
Right.
More carbon emissions being put out than ever. In the next 30 years, the temperature
went
down. So now taking this single factor point, which is CO2, and putting everything on CO2 as far as warming the climate, it's like that doesn't add up for, like, how do you explain that 1940s to 70s period then? And then also, like, even the UN said that the UK would be a Siberian hellscape by 2020 back in like the 90s. They've been everything. Oil was going to run out in the 90s. There's a small think tank group which did some heavy lobbying back in the mid 1900s and later, which was the Club of Rome, and they were all about this environmental doom. And I think that you can actually trace pretty much all of these ideas back to this, which was, you look at it and their solution to everything was degrowth. We need to slow down, the human population, how much we're doing economically, all of this. They just were uncomfortable with that growth, and none of their predictions have come true. So that's...
Yeah, I mean, I'm inclined to agree with everything you're saying. Yeah, it's one of those things that you're right, that people do not remember the bullshit that we've been fed over the years. And if you look back and you look into it, you're like, that's pretty alarming stuff. It's all basically horseshit. None of it really came true. And one of the big problems I guess I have with it, look, I'm all for treating the environment better, 100%. But I'm also for being pragmatic about the effects we're having on it at scale. But I think more importantly, you do have real short-term problems. This isn't one of them. Your real short-term problem is feeding people, is putting a roof over their head, is making sure that people can continue to survive. And we seem to be putting all of that in the back seat compared to this climate agenda. And that to me is quite alarming when you're willing to sacrifice people, the economy, everybody's well-being for something that, again, there's not enough meat on the bone in terms of their argument. And I'm just surprised that they're willing to sacrifice everyone. And then everyone agrees with them. Not everyone, but you know what I mean? A large portion of people jump on board and say that it's okay and want to keep doing it. And I don't know how you right this ship or how they've convinced so many people of this, but one way or another, I hope we start identifying, and I think we are a little bit, that, taking care of yourself today has got to be number one, or else you're not even going to survive to see what tomorrow looks like, or whenever the climate gets better and things are okay. So I think we just need to reorganize our priorities a little bit.
Yeah, I agree. You could on the environmentalism front, you could focus a lot more on things that you can see how successful you're being at, such as, say, limiting plastics in the ocean runoff, these garbage islands that you see in third world countries that essentially get all of our shit electronics shipped over to them and they just end up in a landfill. Things like East Palestine, where the chemical spill into the river, things like that, where you can actually measure as you go. But like, dude, the climate is a 30-year period, is what the World Meteorological Organization, the WMO, defines climate as a 30-year period. And then also CO2, any emissions from CO2 last in the atmosphere for 60 years. So you're now measuring a 30-year period, and let's say we cut all emissions today, all emissions go out the window. You're not even going to be able to see the effect of that for 60 years because all of those emissions are already up there.
Right, because it gets lumped in. It's almost like you look at it in 60 different parts because 60 different years, even if you have a really effective year at scale, when you look at that average, it's a drop in a bucket. It makes literally no difference. So there's actually no way to identify, really your progress, especially because because every year you've got one coming in and one going out, right? As the chain moves, something falls off and something comes in. Unless we were tracking this with the same sort of standards 60 years ago, because that would be at least reasonable. You'd say, okay, every year it's going down a little bit, but if you don't know how bad this year was on year 60 or year 59 when that falls off, you really have no idea about the effect of what you're doing. Yeah, the whole thing.
Yeah, the whole thing. Everything is dependent on models.
Yeah, exactly. Everything. And then so for me, when I look at this, when I look at this study and this report, and their goal here is basically, let's blame the rich and take all their money. I'm like, you guys are crazy. It's just weaponization of bullshit data to try to take more money from people, and it's never going to work.
Well, speaking of stealing money and inefficiently spending it, Trudeau's latest economic update. So the federal government's fall economic statement outlines a plan to spend an additional $20.8 billion over the next 6 years, with most of the money earmarked for new housing initiatives and climate-friendly projects. The government is also projecting a $40 billion deficit for this fiscal year and higher deficits in the years to come. This comes after last year, Finance Minister Chrystia Freeland promised to balance the budget over the next 5 years, but instead she has announced more than $100 billion in additional spending after more than doubling our national debt over the last few years.
So I don't know if Chrystia Freeland's on Vyvanse or cocaine, but it's definitely one of them. When you see her, she is fucking jacked up, and the level of confidence that woman wears on her face after the shit she says is wild. So credit to her for that. Or whatever drug she's taking. That's awesome. Good for you.
I think both is an option.
Yeah, she might be. Look, this just keeps getting worse and worse, right? I don't understand how you go from saying we're going to balance the budget, in 5 years to being like, oh, we need to spend another $100 billion. And, even Trudeau's forecast in 2018, before the pandemic, the 2018 forecast on 2022, 2023 spending is also off by another $100 billion alone. But there's no reason for this. There seems to be no good excuse for any of the things that are happening and why they're spending all this money. And what bothers me is that he claims that they are exercising fiscal responsibility. It's the most insane gaslighting bullshit that I've ever heard. So for me, that's a bit of a problem. And if you want to kind of identify why, I think it's pretty simple. Trudeau, like you said, he printed between $400 and $600 billion since COVID. Like that he also doubled our national debt, doubled the cost of rent, doubled the cost of buying a home. Pretty much doubled the price of gas, not quite. Groceries went up over 300%. You look at all these things, there's no fiscal responsibility. There's no care for the citizens. Actually, what's insane to me is that the NDP leader said that we're not spending enough money. And that actually kind of identifies one of the bigger problems we have here, this coalition government, right? People, like if you look at politics and you just try to understand them economically, it's pretty simple. Conservatives or Republicans tend to be more fiscally responsible. Liberals tend to be more socially responsible. What that means is the conservatives try to stimulate the economy, and liberals and the NDP create social programs to take more money, more taxes. That's kind of like a simple blanket way of looking at it. But what's happening now is our liberals have become so far left that they're where the NDP used to be, and the NDP are self-described socialists at this point, and they have this coalition government. And Jagmeet said it himself. Their only goal is to spend more money. $13 billion on dental care to make sure Trudeau could stay in power. That was Jagmeet's first red line. The next one, pharmacare, $30 billion a year, which I say, there's going to be more money behind that, because when you give people money, people line up for more money. And like you said, government's going to subsidize it? Oh, great. We're just going to increase the prices. So big pharma's just going to charge more. Obviously, that's how this works. And when they say, hey, we're going to spend money on environmental programs and housing, well, I think we just identified the money going into environmental programs is kind of bullshit. So that's kind of a waste. And before that, we were talking about the CMHC. They've already given them billions of dollars, and their efficiency is 2%. So how these people are spending money is ridiculous. How much money they're spending is even more ridiculous. Scotiabank put out a report the other day that said government spending is so high. It's so high. And I want to identify this. Not that it's so much further above standard government spending. That's what they're using as the differentiating factor. The difference of what they should be spending versus what they are has raised interest rates in Canada 2 points. So they're responsible for a massive portion of the rise in interest rates because they're spending so fucking irresponsibly. It's wild to me that these people have the audacity to get in front of a group of people, the country, get in the house and say these things like, we are fixing this, we are fixing that, we are being fiscally responsible, and we're just going to spend another $100 billion. It just drives me insane. But again, I think it's just going to, just to finish up there, I think it only further solidifies that we need a conservative government now to start righting this ship.
So my question would be, do you think their ability to stand in front of crowds and say they are doing the right thing when it comes to spending, do you think that comes from a place of ignorance and actually not understanding how these policies and economics work? Or do you think it comes from a space of just pure authoritarian narcissism and they know what they're doing is wrong, but they are just standing there gaslighting you?
100% gaslighting. These people are not idiots, man. They know, especially at the top, like they know enough information. They're like, well, the things that I just listed, they're like, we know all that stuff is true. So they know what they're saying is bullshit.
Because I sometimes wonder with a guy like Trudeau, Freeland, as much as I dislike her, she seems to, even though she does lie through her teeth, like it does seem to come from a place of she actually understands the concept she's talking about and she's trying to wormhole the way around them. Whereas when I listen to somebody like Trudeau speak about this stuff, I seriously wonder if he has any idea what's going on. And like you said earlier, he's just throwing these policies through. He's being told what he's going to support and what needs to happen. And then, because I see it in those moments when he's forced to talk about these things, which is very rare because the media never really asks him those hard questions. But when he does, you can just tell he's like on a back footing, and it just kind of seems to me like he actually doesn't really understand even the basics.
Well, I was reading something the other day that said 25% of Trudeau's time in office has been spent on vacation. With him not being totally, on the ball or in tune with what's going on. Yeah, that makes sense. And at the end of the day, I think running a country, to his defense in a sense, and which is odd, I hardly ever do that. To his defense, you can't run a country on your own. There's going to be a lot of things that you're not really going to be able to manage all. And we know that. Look at Joe Biden. He can't do anything. The guy cannot make himself lunch. You know what I mean? So when you think he's going to run America, it's just not happening. He's got a support team around him. So I don't think that Trudeau is making all the decisions. However, that's not an excuse for the leader. It's a top-down. That's how this works. So for me, he is ultimately responsible. And I think that this falls on his shoulders. But to your point, I kind of agree. I don't think he's totally tapped into what's going on, but he's not a complete idiot. He's not. Like, he manipulates people well enough that he can't be, he's above average IQ. Maybe not very far, but above average. But when it comes to Freeland, I hate to say this, but she seems like a genuinely evil person. She does. She seems like when you look at how she operates and the things she does and the things she says and how she wears a smile on her face saying really nasty things. And there's a lot of instances. I actually think she is like your sort of, she's your kind of like your Canadian Dr. Evil. Like, I think she's really quite a terrible person. I do, and I mean, again, I feel bad saying it, but what I see with her and how I've kind of like my read on her and kind of understanding a bit about psychology and just how she operates, I think she's got some wires crossed, dude. And I don't think she gives a shit. But I think she's only doing it to gaslight, and they're doing it to stay in power. Because think about it like this: if you say something enough in the media, it's true, right? Especially if you're the person in charge, you're the governing body, and you control the mainstream media. So when you look at mainstream media, a lot of it just comes down to sound bites, right? So it's these few things. We like fiscal responsibility. Yeah, you're gonna have 10 guys that are calling you a horse's ass. I mean, like, that's so irresponsible, not true. But a lot of the people that just watch the mainstream media, this is what they see. They see fiscal responsibility. We're helping you do this. We're looking out for Canadians. Whereas the people on like you and I, are looking in the background and going, all this stuff is false, but we're looking at channels that are just less watched, unfortunately. So when they do these things, yeah, sure, they're gaslighting, but they're also building their continued narrative in the media so that they can try to stay in power.
Well, yeah, speaking of psychology, it's called psychological priming, because humans have a very hard time differentiating between repetition and truth. You tell somebody something enough times, like you lock a person in a room and repeat to them for years on end that the sky is yellow. It's only a matter of time until they start actually believing that, if you're able to keep their eyes peeled from what the sky actually looks like, and you just keep repeating line after line after line to them.
This is the worst decade we've had in Canada since the Great Depression. That's wild. And they're like, oh, everything's fine. Why are you guys complaining? Everything's good. Bro, statistically, it's the worst we've had since the Depression. The actual Depression. So for me, like, they find a way to paint a picture in the media by manipulating the CPI, by having a bad year through COVID so that no matter what, your next year had growth in GDP, so you can, technically say you're not in a recession or a depression. They have these little tools that they use. But if you look at how people are living, this is as bad as it's ever been in my lifetime. I'm not even 40 years old, so I know that people have had tough goes of it, and if further in the past. But this is horrible right now, and they come out here and they say these things which are just complete bullshit. And I guess it's just kind of part of the game. And you say the media is in lockstep with them. They control the media. They pay the media, so you're not going to see anything different. I just hope people are smart enough to differentiate between what they're being told and how they actually feel, right? Because you can say a lot of things in politics that don't affect you on a day-to-day basis. But this one really does. Everyone is really suffering at scale economically. We are all struggling to have a better life, and we are all struggling to, a lot of people are struggling to put food on the table, put a roof over the head, and all these things. And I hope that they can discern between the two to say, hey, maybe I supported Trudeau in the past. Maybe you did, and that's fine. But at this point, don't let them pull the wool over your eyes again on this particular issue, because you can see right in front of your face that you can't afford the same life you had, not even close, and it's going to continue to get worse.
Yeah, well, there is somebody who was just elected that is looking to deal with the terrible economic situation that they're faced with. So the Argentina just elected libertarian Javier Milei as its new president on Sunday, rolling the dice on an outsider with radical views to fix an economy battered by triple-digit inflation, a looming recession, and rising poverty. Milei is pledging economic shock therapy. His plans include shutting the central bank, ditching the peso, and slashing spending. Argentina has decided not to join BRICS following the victory of Javier Milei in the country's presidential election. Milei has criticized relations with communist countries, particularly China. So this will be a good, I consider myself definitely a libertarian. Some days, depending on what's been going on in the news, I might even be as radical to say that I would hop on board with an anarcho-capitalist ideology. So I think Milei down in Argentina will be a good test scenario and kind of example to see how those policies work, which is, the exact opposite of everything we've been seeing.
Yeah, it's interesting, right? Like, first of all, I think this guy's fucking hilarious. I do. He's running around with a chainsaw with his name on it and shit. Like, it is kind of funny. I do feel bad that, the world is immediately trying to be like, oh, he's just like Trump. And it's like, you know what? He uses sensationalized speech a little bit to sort of build his case. But I kind of get it. Like, how else do you penetrate a political system that's already gentrified? So I kind of understand his stance there. That's just kind of in support of that guy. I think it's hilarious. He's also got this hilarious, his look to me too is just like, let's go, dude. Yeah. Like, he's really shaking things up, So that whole thing. You're seeing a lot more of this in other parts of the world. The Netherlands just looks like they're going to vote in what they're saying far-right populists. You're seeing it in a ton of countries throughout Europe. You're seeing a lot of people shift to the right. You're seeing it in Italy. And I actually think the president, is she a prime minister or president? I think it's president. Melanie, what's her name? I feel bad that I don't remember her name. Sorry, Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni. That's her name. I butchered it. I apologize. Anyway, she's doing a great job, but it's really more about like, hey, we got to take care of Italy first. And that's what's happening in a lot of these cases, right? They're like, oh, she's a Nazi. She's this, she's... No, she's not. She's trying to fix a country that's falling apart. And a lot of these people are voting in opposition that is, say, far right or libertarian, or depending on the case, like Argentina was in pretty rough shape. I think their inflation was up like 140%. Like, they needed a massive change immediately. Places in that part of the world, they seem to have a lot more fluctuation economically that can be a lot more dire. I don't know enough about why, but I understand why they do more sort of radical change in policy and politicians, so I get it. But again, you're seeing this at scale in the Western world. People are ready for change. If I'm being honest, most of it is a part of the liberal agenda, but I don't even think people care so much of who they're voting for as much as that they're voting in someone different to try to fix the problem, because that's how far off track we've gotten with things. You know what I mean? And I think he's a great example. And I think that, like you said, we will get to see what this looks like, because he will be, probably the best live example we're going to see of someone that is willing to cut 80% of the government overnight. And we'll see how that plays out. I have a feeling it's going to go a lot better than, maybe your left wing or your mainstream media are currently saying. Just like when Elon cut 80% of Twitter staff, they seem to be doing just fine. It depends if you ask CNN, but they're functioning. They're doing okay. So for me, I'm hopeful. We'll see how it goes.
Yeah, see, I think what's really interesting is something that you pointed out there, where it seems like anybody who is not on board with the UN's Agenda 2030, which is all of these radical climate change goals, social programs, all of this kind of stuff. To me, I look at these and I go, these are the far radical ideas that essentially society can just be mechanized and turned top to bottom however we want it. We can just reorganize and the government can solve everything. That in and of itself is the radical idea. And it's funny to me to see all of these people, whether it be the guy that was just elected in the Netherlands, whether it be Milei, whether it be in Italy. You see that if they're not on board with radical left-wing ideologies, they immediately get put in they're far right.
Oh yeah.
And you're like, I don't know about the Netherlands guy too in depth, but one of the articles I was reading on him where they were calling him far right, everything under the book, everything in the book, they were pointing to how he was saying the immigration policies have gone too far and that the country is starting to suffer because of them. And it's like, that's your smoking gun for essentially right-wing extremism, is just saying that there is a place where immigration can go too far and we've hit it. Like, to me, that's a very short bar to have as far as extremism.
Yeah, well, I think what the media does is they weaponize these things because they make it incendiary by saying, oh, it's this one thing, it's so terrible. Anything, like you said, anything that goes against the grain of this liberal ideology is obviously far right, and far right is the devil, it's the enemy, and it all has to die. But there's so much nuance to it. And what's every country, you look at, I think people look at the United States and go, well, then that guy's in charge, like Trump is the winner, so Trump's in charge, so the Republicans are in charge. But actually, if you look at how politics work around the world, in a lot of cases where there is democracy, you actually have a lot of coalition governments. So the guy that's going to win in the Netherlands, he's got 35 out of 150 votes. He's got nowhere near a majority, so it's a three-party coalition. There's a lot more checks and balances here than people know. So when you see these things, it's like, that's actually going to be a team effort, thinking about real problems and trying to find a solution so that their country operates better. It's not saying they're xenophobic. Look, we have immigration problems here. They've got them in the States. This is happening all over the world right now. It's not wrong to identify these things. It's wrong to make it inflammatory to say that it's a problem. And that's the issue we have with the media these days. And what happens, in my opinion, is, there's this cyclical nature to political power. And what happens is you see it at sort of a larger scale than within the country. Within the country, it changes hands, right? Every 4 years, every 8 years, back and forth, back and forth. But when you've got a large portion of the world, like the West had basically become this liberal group together. It was like this Western democratic ideology was happening, right? So all of these people were sort of hanging on to power together. They were all supporting one another. When the apparatus gets this big, there is something different happens. So what I notice is you try to implement policies for positive change. And I think that's really what political parties try to do to some degree to begin with. You're seeing it with conservatives, you're seeing it with Malay, you're seeing it in Netherlands. They have the right intentions to begin with. But over time, if the apparatus gets so big and is so vast in terms of it being throughout the entire West, there's such a collective interest in keeping it in power. Once you start losing ground, because eventually it should be the other person in power because you have opposing views and you're going to fix different things. And that's just sort of the cyclical nature of all of it. I get it. They start doing more and more radical things to maintain that power. So we've been looking at this sort of Western liberal ideology that's been growing and swelling over the last 20 years, primarily. And they're all starting to lose power. It's all starting to fall off. And that's why you're seeing this in all these other countries. You're seeing places like the Netherlands and all throughout Europe and all these other places, and now in Argentina, where that big apparatus is falling apart because that big group, the Western liberal group, started doing things that were so radical to maintain power that eventually everyone kind of goes, wait, this doesn't make sense anymore. These aren't really liberal ideas. This isn't like, they're pro-war now. That's never been a democratic view. And you're starting to see it all fall apart. And I think this is just a changing of this big 20-year guard that is slowly deteriorating and slowly falling apart because regular citizens like you and I have kind of had enough of it. Now, that being said, it's going to go back the other way someday. I'd be willing to bet that while you and I are alive, providing we have reasonably we live long enough, you're going to see sort of this maybe right-wing or conservative or Republican sort of swell in maybe this part of the world or somewhere else where they start with the right ideas and then over time they radicalize. Because as you start losing power, you become more radical. Then the other people come in to save the day, and it just kind of goes in this circle. And I think we're just watching. We're at like the precipice of this big breakup and this thing sort of the guard changing hands. And I think that's why you're seeing a lot of this.
Yeah, no, I agree. And something I've been trying to change even recently and checking friends on it and all this stuff is when they talk about, oh, liberalism is such a terrible policy. It's the cause for everything that's going wrong right now. It's like, I think we need to redefine that so hard because, I mean, like classical liberalism is defined as a political and economic doctrine that emphasizes individual autonomy, equality of opportunity, and the protection of individual rights primary to life, liberty, and property against both the state and private economic actors, including businesses. It's like, so a lot of these policies that are being put in place are anti-liberal. They're collectivist policies, and that's really how I see that cyclical nature of history. Is it goes back and forth between liberalism and almost like tyrannical collectivism. And I think right now we're at that space where people are starting to realize that the concept of the greater good has been used to fool them into giving away their individual liberties. And I think that is why we're seeing a lot of candidates like RFK, Vivek Ramaswamy, Trump, Geert Wilders in Holland, Millet, all of this kind of stuff, even though all those people are very different in how they want to approach this collectivism. They all have very different policies and everything that they want to put in place. But at the end of the day, the one thing that does kind of bind them together is, to me, it does seem like a adherence to classic liberalism, which is the autonomy of the individual.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of funny. I've been saying this a lot lately, is that if you vote conservative today, you're basically voting for traditional liberals. That's kind of what it's become. And, you know, you see throughout history, because Hitler was far right. When any time anybody gets too much power or they're going to lose their power, they will do radical things. It doesn't matter what political umbrella they are under. They will do crazy shit to stay in power. Power corrupts people no matter what you do. It just happens over time, especially when there's such a large apparatus behind it. You know what I mean? It's not one individual. You don't really get benevolence from a group like that.
I even struggle to classify Hitler as far right, dude, because think about it. You're telling me the guy that waged war on humanity because nobody liked his art was a staunch conservative?
You know what? In fairness, I will admit I parroted that particular piece of information. I guess I should look a little further into it. I'm not sure. I suppose, like, I thought they had right-leaning policies, and that was kind of his shtick.
The Nazi Party was a socialist party. They positioned themselves as the alternative to the communist parties who were getting a lot of...
Okay, but so socialist compared to communist, though, I'd say they're the right wing.
And this is something that I've thought about in depth, which is the difference between fascism and communism, because a lot of people, when I call things communist or Marxist, they'll say I'm being hyperbolic. But I think what ends up happening is a lot of people... But they'll have no problem saying that exact thing that I'm calling communism or Marxism. They have no problem calling it fascism. And I think what ends up being the issue is people think of fascism as being authoritarian. Like anything authoritarian is fascism, which is true. Fascists are authoritarian, but so are communists. And I think the main difference, and this is why I do believe that a lot of these revolutionary ideas that we're seeing be brought across through things like Agenda 2030 are Marxism, is because the difference is fascism and communism are both tyrannical collectivism. Like fascism itself even has roots in Roman language, which means stronger as a bundle, essentially. Like a bundle of sticks brought into one is stronger than each on their own, which is the same principle as communism, but the difference between the two is the justifications that are used to get there. So I think fascism preys a lot more on pathologizing strength and like kind of traditional, almost like masculinity. It turns like it's like the quote unquote toxic masculinity would be the reasons for fascism. But then on the other side, I look at communism and Marxism as kind of like a toxic femininity, which is pathologizing compassion, turning this idea, and I think that's exactly what we're seeing right now with all of these things, is we need to become tyrannical and authoritarian because we care about everybody so much.
I just wish everyone would leave each other the fuck alone. I mean, just let me do what I want to do and leave me alone. I'm not going to hurt anybody. I'm not going to take anybody's shit, and I think the world will be a better place. But yeah, like you said, no matter what, it seems that, you know, you get a party in power long enough, and one way or another, they find themselves to the same place under a different name. And I think we're there in a lot of I think we're getting there pretty quickly in a modern day way in the Western world. And I think, you know, seeing guys like Millet win in a runoff election with 55% of the vote just shows you that the world has had enough and it's time for a change.
Right on. Anything else you wanted to cover today?
No, that's it. Thanks, everybody. We will see you next time.